Dimebag Darrell didn't just play guitar, he lived it. Every note, pure passion. Critics called it noise, fans called it genius, Dime called it a typical Tuesday. Other bands used pyro. Dimebag's sound was the fire hazard. The music industry tried to put him in a box, but Dimebag Darrell built his own out of amps and pure attitude.
Like, subscribe, thank you.
Darrell Lance Abbott, who would become Dimebag Darrell, had music in his blood. He was born in 1966, and his dad, Jerry Abbott, actually was successful at producing country music, producing and writing for artists like Freddie King and Bugs Henderson. Darrell's brother Vinny was 2 years older than him, and their dad tried to convince them to get more into the country music side of things. Jerry would have country musicians jamming in the studio, and he would invite Dime and Vinny to come in and sit in with them whenever they could. But Dime really didn't want to go the country route. He was much more into the heavier stuff. Priest, Black Sabbath, Kiss, and Van Halen, to name a few. He started really digging into the guitar playing, Ace Frehley from Kiss, Tony Iommi, Randy Rhoads, and of course Eddie Van Halen. When Darrell was 12, his dad got him a cherry sunburst Hondo Les Paul copy. And to round out his early rig, he also had a small pig nose amp. He got this rig around 1978, and originally almost didn't get it, because Jerry had given his son a choice. He said you could either get a BMX bike or a guitar, and Darrell had actually picked the bike. But not long after that, he heard Black Sabbath for the first time, and that completely changed his mind. So he goes back to his dad and says, hey, can I trade the bike for a guitar? And his dad went with it. With that Hondo Les Paul in his hands, Darrell became obsessive. He'd practice anywhere from 8 to 12 hours a day playing, completely holed up in his room. He'd put on those Kiss or Black Sabbath or Priest records and do everything he could to try to match it note for note. In 1981, at 15 years old, Darrell and his brother got together and put together Pantera. Vinny was already dead set on playing drums, and Darrell was already set up with the guitar. So they brought in Donnie Hart on lead vocals and Terry Glaze on rhythm guitar, and they also had Tommy Bradford on bass. But they definitely underwent a few lineup changes. Donnie Hart ended up leaving, so the lead vocal duties were taken over by Terry. And Terry was originally playing rhythm guitar as well, but he finally stopped altogether playing and just sang, letting Darrell take over both the lead and rhythm duties. Then in '82, Tommy Bradford left, so they brought in Rex Brown, who was known at the time as Rex Rocker, on the bass. And Pantera started playing local places around the Texas area, including the Basement, Cardi's, Savvy's in Houston, and Joe's Garage in Dallas. Between 83 and 85, they ended up recording 3 records at Pentago Sound Studio, which is owned by their dad, Jerry Abbott. Listening to the early recordings, it's hard to believe how the band would evolve into the band that we've come to know. For example, their first album, Metal Magic, sounds uncannily like early Kiss in parts. In other parts, it sounds a lot like Priest. And during this period, Darrell was going as Diamond Darrell. It would be some time before he would change to Dimebag.
Hey, I'm Dimebag Darrell, lead guitarist.
For the next release, Projects in the Jungle, the group started taking on an early Def Leppard sound. Interestingly, unlike their first album, which was recorded when Dime was just 16 years old, where he had more of an Ace Frehley kind of influence going on, with Projects in the Jungle, you could hear a lot of Randy Rhoads influence in his playing. By their third album, I Am the Night, you could hear a lot of Priest influence in full force. This one kind of marked a turning point towards getting them a little bit more towards the edgier side of metal, though they would have a ways to go before they became the Pantera we would know. But they got a little closer with Power Metal, the album that they completed in 1988. And by this point, they were sounding uncannily like Judas Priest. But it's also pretty obvious that Dime's playing really had shaped up by this time. It was very tight and polished. and the band was definitely ready for the new era that they were about to embark on. And this was also Phil Anselmo's debut with the band. He had one hell of a high metal range, but his singing would definitely become much more brutal very soon after this. But the record label that the band was signed to, Gold Mountain Records, they just weren't happy with them. The label wanted the band to have this really kind of slick, polished hair metal sound that really they just were not going for. Darrell's riffs were already there, and they were already evident on the power metal release. But now that they had Phil in the band who could pretty much sing any way, they really wanted to go in a much different direction. Now, originally the band tried to get a deal with Metal Blade Records. They asked for $75,000 to record the next upcoming album, but they were completely rejected. However, the people over at Atco Records really liked their sound and where they were going for, so they signed them right up. Pantera's first major label album, Cowboys from Hell, showed that they completely landed on the map in terms of not being an 80s hair metal band, but going much more skull-crushing and thrashy. Dimebag Darrell's guitar work on the album was spellbinding. They were heavier than heavy in a lot of ways. And Dime managed to blend together speed, precision, with a real soulful approach. Songs like Primal Concrete Sledge, Domination, Dime was busting out all the tricks. Insane fretwork, groove-laden riffs that cut like a buzzsaw, and lots of nice whammy bar dive bombs. This wasn't straight-up neoclassical thrash. It had a bit of early Metallica feel to it in a lot of places, but a different kind of intensity to it. Their own level of intensity. It was like the perfect marriage between thrash and classic rock. The power ballad Cemetery Gates blew a lot of people's minds because it had so much feeling, and at the same time, it was truly like a thrash metal power ballad, almost like a new genre in and of itself. And Dimebag was also really a key songwriter on the album. He was either writing or co-writing every single thing with Vinnie Paul and Rex Brown. And Phil, by this time, was singing viciously. Interestingly, it took a while for the album to catch on. Probably because a lot of people just couldn't wrap their minds around what this band was doing. They did shoot some great videos for Psycho Holiday and Cowboys from Hell, so they did also manage to get some MTV airplay out of it. But really, for the time, the band was still from another planet as far as people were concerned. An interesting note is that on Cowboys from Hell, during that solo, Dime employed some really cool symmetrical runs that were reminiscent of some of what Eddie Van Halen would have done, where he'd take a symmetrical pattern and run it all the way up the strings instead of playing a traditional scale or mode. It added a real exotic feel to the solo and made a lot of people who've heard it the first time go, "Who the hell is this guy playing the guitar?" Dime's tone on the album was mainly centered around the solid-state Randall RG100 amp that he was using. He also had a Furman PQ3 parametric EQ pedal, and he would run the signal through this pedal first, shaping the frequencies, and then go into an MXR 6-band EQ for further tone sculpting before actually hitting the Randall's amp input. And it really served two purposes: to shape the tone, but by design, it also worked as a boost setup as well. So he was pretty much working in gain stages. Dime really preferred solid state over tube. He felt like tube was just kind of too mellow or too soft, like it was surrounding your body. And he really wasn't looking for that warm sound. He liked the fact that it was really tight and present, and the sound was just immediate coming out of it. And even though Dime didn't have a lot of riffs for the Cowboys from Hell album as he was putting it together, the one thing he said was that he just wanted it to sound like one bad motherfucker, completely refreshing and new. And their look changed too. Instead of looking all glam and poppy the way they were looking, they just went right back to the bell-bottom jeans and long hair and just kind of throwdown. During this period, they also came up with their own signature drink called the Blacktooth Grin, which was Crown Royal whiskey, Seagram 7 whiskey, and Coke all mixed together. And it became their official cocktail as they became popular. The band toured really hard behind this first album, playing nearly 200 shows, and the tour basically spanned 2 years, so it was a lot of playing. Dimebag Darrell was considered pretty wild and quite the heavy drinker, but by this time Pantera definitely had a reputation as being a great heavy band. People were looking forward to what their next offering would be. They took it up another notch with Vulgar Display of Power in 1992. Far more heavy and far more intense than Cowboys from Hell. They had brought in producer Terry Date, who has a track history of recording metal bands. Mouth for War, A New Level, and Walk showcased this new skull-crushing sound that the band had managed to pull out. The solo on Walk is a perfect juxtaposition of an actual blues solo fused with skull-crushing metal. Dimebag's tone on this is almost creamy, and yet he completely bastardized what had been almost a standard blues lick solo into the sweet diminished line, bringing it all back into the main riff. Dime's blues roots came out wickedly on this one. It was also during this period that he was no longer Diamond Darrell, but he was renamed Dimebag Darrell by Phil, and the name stuck, so he went with it. The name came due to the fact that Darrell never wanted any more than $10 worth, or a dime bag, of weed at any one given time, fearing that he would get caught with it. What's interesting is that as sonically different as all these albums are throughout their lineage, to this point they had still actually recorded them all in the same studio, Pantego Sound, that Jerry Abbott owned. But for the next album, Far Beyond Driven, their father had actually closed Pantego Sound and opened up a new one in Nashville, Tennessee called Abtract. Jerry was really hoping to become a well-known, established country songwriter, and so he figured Nashville would be the perfect place to be. It kind of drove the band nuts, because they had to fly out there, and studio time, of course, is very expensive, so by having it in Dime's father's studio, of course, they were saving a lot of money, but now there was some distance between home and where they had to record. Dime said in one interview that they were flying to Nashville for 3 weeks at a time, writing songs and cutting them, so the band members would spend a lot of downtime, partying and doing drugs. But when it came time to mix the album, they took it back to Dallas Sound Labs, which was much closer to home. But the album totally took off. It was the heaviest album ever to debut at number 1. Unlike most bands that would get lighter over time, this band just got heavier and heavier. And on this album, it was their heaviest they have gotten yet. Punishing tracks like Becoming, 25 Years, and Slaughtered had some of Dime's most intense rhythm and lead work ever recorded to date. The song I'm Broken was actually inspired by the chronic back pain that Phil was going through. As a favorite among Dime fans, it has this really catchy main riff that was actually born from sound checks. When it hits that breakdown, chug chug, chug chug, chug chug, heads start banging. And then Dime takes it home with a double-track solo panned hard left and right. It's chock full of enough sequencing and screams to make it downright scary. Now, to promote the album, Pantera ended up touring with Skid Row and Soundgarden, and both of those bands drew more of that rock mainstream audience to them. They also opened up for Megadeth in Europe for Megadeth's Countdown to Extinction tour. Dave Mustaine was fighting some demons on his own, sneaking in bottles of mouthwash to drink since the band couldn't have any alcohol on the bus. Dave Mustaine was struggling with alcoholism, and the band just didn't want it around. Pantera also toured with White Zombie and did some headlining shows in '92. The album was so popular, and they had a huge, relentless touring schedule going on, so the band was reaching brand new heights. But with Phil's escalating drug use, there were already mounting tensions within the band. A lot of the lyrics on Vulgar Display Power also referenced drug abuse and personal destruction, but less than 2 months later, tensions would totally come to a head when Phil Anselmo overdosed on heroin after a homecoming show in Texas. In '96, the band recorded The Great Southern Trendkill, and this was a much sludgier, darker sound. There was a lot of inner turmoil with the band, as well as all the substance abuse going on, and it really reflected itself in the sound of the album. And now the band weren't even recording together. Phil Anselmo had recorded his vocals separately, laying them down at Trent Reznor's Nothing Studios in New Orleans. But Dime's playing was absolutely as powerful as ever. But he definitely took a much more looser and experimental vibe to it. He incorporated a lot of drop tunings, new and fresh techniques, and did a lot of wild stuff with the whammy bar. Songs like Floods, Drag the Waters, 13 Steps to Nowhere were showcasing Dime's evolving style, which had a lot more droning and dissonant riffs and unconventional song structure. On this album, Dime also managed to lay down what many consider to be his best guitar solo ever on the 7-minute epic Floods. Floods is a haunting track, echoing some Chris Cornell Soundgarden era influence. Phil's vocals on it are tortured, using all sorts of kind of distorted effects mixed in with his main clean vocal, with some rotary speaker effects in parts to make it that much more chilling. And then right before the solo, everything just completely turns on its head. Dime starts laying into the whammy bar, but hitting these rhythms leading into the solo, and it is just dark and purely frightening. And then his solo, double-tracked, panned, harmonizing, literally just pulling out all of the stops. It starts off with some of the most musical pinch harmonics one would ever hear. Perfectly tuned and timed squeals that just add emotion before Dime ramps it up, and again double-tracked but now panned in the center. In your face, emotional, soloing assault all the way. It's no surprise that this would be considered as one of his most standout solos ever. The band remained a very powerful live draw on the Trendkill tour, and they ended up doing an official live album from a show taken from the Dynamo Open Air Festival in the Netherlands. But the group was slowly splintering apart. Phil started getting more into his side projects like Superjoint, Ritual, and Down. Dime and Vinny were really quite unsure of Pantera's future at that point and were kind of frustrated. In 2000, Pantera did their 9th and final studio album, Reinventing the Steel. For this, they brought in producer Sterling Winfield, and it was also produced by Vinnie Paul. And they took things back to their more thrashy roots, but they also kept some of the dark vibes of the great Southern Trendkill. And the overall result was a pretty good melding of the two styles. Tracks like Goddamn Electric, Death Rattle, and Revolution Is My Name showcased Dime's combination of scorching leads and crushing rhythms, and he was continuing to experiment with his use of pinch harmonics and whammy bar. Dime also brought in the Digitech whammy pedal, and he put it to really good use on the intro to Hellbound. He also used his usual Dean ML guitars, and also a classic Cherry Sunburst Dean from Hell model. And the lyrics were definitely lighter than they were on the Great Southern Trendkill, more geared toward perseverance, rebellion, and the power of heavy metal. And Reinventing the Steel itself, the title was more geared towards the band making a statement that they were just kind of returning to their roots at this point. During the writing process, however, Dime and Vinnie Paul found out that their mom had passed away from cancer, and so they were just completely devastated. And though Phil had cleaned up for a while, he had gotten right back into using drugs again, and so tensions were just reaching a boiling point. And like the previous album, Phil recorded his vocals separately from the rest of the band, and his behavior was a lot more erratic. He was showing up late, or sometimes just not at all to sessions. And when they toured behind the album, in April of 2000, the US leg included an ill-fated stint at Ozfest. The band just wasn't feeling it. They ended up placed on the second stage. And of course, Phil's condition wasn't getting any better at this point, but so the band was continuing to splinter apart. And then in October, Phil ended up breaking 2 ribs in a bizarre accident when he was working at the House of Shock haunted house attraction in New Orleans. So some shows had to be postponed. And then, of course, the following year, when September 11th happened, Pantera's European tour had to be canceled. After the abrupt ending of Pantera's tour on September 11th, 2001, the band went into an official hiatus. But sadly, Pantera would officially break up in 2003. The brothers just couldn't resolve their disputes with Phil, who they saw as being distracted by his own side projects and whose drug use by that time was just out of control. And both Dime and Vinny were pretty devastated by the breakup. Dime felt as if everything had just been ripped out from underneath him. Plus, they really couldn't continue Pantera because otherwise they would have fallen into legal disputes over the name. So that's when Dimebag Darrell and Vinnie Paul decided that they were going to form a brand new band. In February of 2003, Darrell and Vinnie started recording demos for their new project at Darrell's backyard studio. They brought in Pat Lachman, who had been in the Rob Halford solo lineup and also Diesel Machine, and Bob Zilla on the bass to round out the lineup. The original name of the band was going to be Newfound Power, which would ultimately become the name of their debut album. But they all settled on Damageplan. In 2003, Damageplan signed with Elektra Records. And for Dime, this was definitely a fresh start. Considering how bitterly Pantera had ended, the brothers found a new creative outlet in this group. Musically, they were able to stay pretty much in the same vein as Pantera, but they took it in much more of a stripped-down, thrashier direction. Vinnie Paul had said during those days that that was the most excited he had seen Dime since the early days of Pantera. They had a renewed energy and focus, and they were determined to let the music speak for itself instead of being defined by the past. In 2004, Damageplan released their debut album, Newfound Power. Songs like Pride, Save Me, and Breathing New Life featured Dime's signature razor-sharp riffs, blistering solos, and thick, mid-scoop guitar tone. Metal critics liked it, and it hit the charts at number 38, selling 44,000 copies in its first week alone. During this time, Dimebag was also busy with a bunch of side projects and guest appearances. He did an album with David Allan Coe called Rebel Meets Rebel, which is a country metal album. It was a perfect blend of Coe's twangy voice and tongue-in-cheek lyrics with Dime's heavy riffing. Dime also contributed to songs by Anthrax, King Diamond, Nickelback, Godsmack, and others. Frank Bello from Anthrax even joked that Dime had collaborated with them so much he might as well just be a sixth member of the band. One notable show they embarked on in support of their debut album, and this was before the US tour, was at the Download Festival in the UK in June. Damageplan was actually scheduled to play in one of the smaller tent stages that night, but they ended up getting switched to an earlier main stage slot. However, during the ferry ride over from France, Dime ended up being completely smashed. I thought he might be able to sleep it off, but since the time slot moved earlier, he got stuck playing the whole thing completely hungover. During the last quarter of 2004, they launched into the US tour, calling the tour Devastation Across the Nation. The tour wound its way across the US, hitting clubs packed with metalheads eager to dig into what they've been up to. One notable show before their very last one was their second to the last show, which took place in Buffalo, New York. Nick Norton, who played guitar for a local Pantera tribute band, had his dream come true when Dime actually invited him up on the stage. Originally, he thought he was just going to sing some backups as the band launched into Walk, but then for the solo section, Dime handed him his guitar and let him to rip over it. After the show, the band went out and hit some casinos to gamble. On December 8th, 2004, tragedy struck. Nathan Gale, who was a 25-year-old former Marine with mental health issues, was supposedly really upset that Pantera had broken up the previous year, arrived outside of the All Rosa Villa nightclub in Columbus, Ohio, a place that Dimebag has played at multiple times before. There were 4 groups slated to play, and only about 250 people showed up, even though the place had capacity for 600. While live metal music was pounding inside, Nathan was out in the club parking lot. He was wearing a hockey jersey and a hooded sweatshirt. One of the fans walking in noticed him and asked him why he wasn't out there watching the show. Nathan said, "I'm not here to see any shitty local bands." Then the fan said, "At least you could go in and stay warm." Nathan said, "No, man, I'm just going to wait for Damageplan." The club manager just thought he was another hanger-on that was trying to get in to meet the band. and eventually had one of his guys ask Nathan to leave. But once Damageplan got on stage, Nathan scaled a 6-foot-high fence and ran in through the side door of the club. He was pounding his way very fast through the club, past a sound booth and some pool tables, and he made his way over to the left side of the stage. Nathan had a shaved head, and by the way he looked, everybody thought that he was just there to do some stage diving. The singer for one of the bands who are opening said that Nathan looked like he was on a complete mission, very angry, almost like he was walking in a battle. Before Nathan made it on stage, Dimebag, who had been at the front of the stage, in front of the audience, went back toward his amp to make some adjustments. Once the adjustments were made, he got right back into playing. As Dimebag was standing there, headbanging and playing, completely oblivious to what was happening, Nathan had rushed the stage and went right over to his side with his weapon drawn. You could hear multiple pops, and Dime had been hit multiple times, at least once in the forehead. The band went on for a couple beats, even though the guitar had stopped and was already feeding back. Then they could hear the drums and the bass stop, with only the vocals going for maybe another beat. And then the only audible sound from the band was the feedback of Dime's guitar, still ringing out from his amp amid the chaos. A lot of the staff and the audience at the time thought that maybe some firecrackers had gone off. It wasn't until the band stopped, with Dime's guitar still feeding back, that they knew something was up. Nathan got tackled by a security guard as he started popping into the crowd as well. One of the roadies for the opening groups, Travis Burnett, tried to fight Nathan off, asking him, "Dude, what the fuck you doing?" with Nathan telling him to get out of here, get out of the way. And so as Travis tried to grab him, Nathan took a pop at him too, but the bullet went through his shirt. A nurse who was in the crowd rushed the stage and started doing chest compressions on Dime. As this whole thing went down, a guy implored anybody in the audience or in the club to quickly call 911 as soon as possible. Officer James Neigemeyer got that call, and he arrived in 3 minutes. By this time, Nathan had taken a drum tech hostage, John Cat Brooks, who he had hit 3 times as Brooks tried to disarm him, and was working his way to the back door of the club. Officer James had a long barrel, and knowing that time wasn't on his side, he was waiting for the perfect opportunity. He didn't want to hit the hostage, so it was a very surgical operation. By this time, Gale knew he was done for. Officers had made it by this time and were already surrounding the front of the stage. The window of opportunity was closing, though, as Gale was now pointing it at the hostage's head. Officer Neigemeyer was able to neutralize him by hitting him directly in the face. He was gone instantly. It was a very heroic move by James Neigemeyer, because he hadn't even waited for backup to arrive. He had no idea how it was going to play out, and he was reassured at the end by one of the guys working there that it was a move that he had to make. But that definitely wasn't enough, because afterwards James suffered from PTSD. He ended up discharging from service and is still in treatment over the incident. But nevertheless, by him neutralizing the threat, he saved a lot of lives that night. There was some speculation that Gale was also after Dime's brother Vinny, and that when he was brought down, he still had 35 rounds left. Not counting Gale, 4 people died in that senseless incident. Dimebag, Nathan Bray, who was a fan who jumped on stage and heroically tried to save Dime, Aaron Hawk, who was an employee of the club, and their bodyguard Jeff Mayhem Thompson. What makes the story crazier and more tragic is that about 6 months before this incident, Nathan Gale was actually at another Damageplan concert in Cincinnati. Most likely having some kind of psychotic episode, he ended up damaging $5,000 worth of equipment and was removed from the stage by security. From then on out, security has definitely tightened in clubs and other venues where live music is played. To that point in time, music events like this were always seen as peaceful occasions, just for people to get together and rock out. And a player who was as beloved as Dime, nobody would have thought that he would have been a victim of something so heinous. Countless musicians have cited Dimebag as a huge influence and source of inspiration. Jonathan Davis from Korn had said that if there was no Dimebag Darrell, there would be no Korn. When Dime hit the scene, Slash called him one of the best new guitar players that came out over a long period of time. And Skid Row's Sebastian Bach said that Dime reinvented heavy metal guitar. But beyond the musical impact that Dime had, he was also known for being really warm, open, and fun-loving. He was the kind of guy who wanted to show you his record collection and make you a drink. A lot of fans felt like he was one of them. He was a kindred spirit, more of a misfit kid who was living the dream, but it was through hard work and dedication. His girlfriend, Rita Haney, had said that he would be really surprised by how many people's lives he actually touched. At Dime's memorial, Eddie Van Halen and Zakk Wylde showed up to pay tribute. A few weeks before the horrific incident where Dime was tragically killed, he had actually met Eddie Van Halen for the first time. Eddie was planning on putting out a line of replicas of his Strike guitar, and Dime asked him if he could purchase an advanced copy of it for 30 grand. And Eddie told him, no, I'm going to go ahead and have a special one made for you instead, and I'll give it to you as a gift. That, of course, never materialized due to the tragedy that would occur not long after. After Darrell's death, his girlfriend was discussing with his brother Vinnie Paul which guitar to bury Darrell with in his Kiss casket. Eddie Van Halen called and said that he would provide a guitar. Eddie showed up and brought his original black and yellow striped Bumblebee guitar that was pictured on the back cover of Van Halen 2. This was the original, not a replica. He gave the guitar to Rita, who placed the Bumblebee guitar into Darrell's casket. Eddie had said an original for an original. And with tears in her eyes, she whispered, "See, baby, you didn't get a replica. You got the one." The loss of Dimebag was devastating. It was a blow deeply felt by the music world and beyond. And through it all, Vinnie, his brother in both blood and music, continued to carry the torch for both of them. Tragically, we would lose Vinnie Paul as well, as he passed away in 2018 from heart disease. But the Abbott brothers' impact on music is undeniable, and their music remains an unstoppable force. Thanks so much to all my subscribers. And if you haven't subscribed yet, make sure to smack that subscribe button and join the family. And if you could kindly hit the like button, I do appreciate it as well. Thank you so much for watching.